Okay, simple summary for this week. This kind of goes as a complementary piece with the written lecture that you have, which covers, the overview of the events. And what I want to do in this video is talk about the personalities to give those events context. Okay, so first of all, this is a point I wish I'd made earlier on. History is not, there's a thing called the great man theory out there in historiography, and it's the idea that people who have a casual understanding of history think that history is decided by like 10 people, right? That the American government was founded by the founding fathers, which is true enough, but it was the creation of a whole nation and the work of thousands of people, and millions of people have lived in this country since then, and everybody to some degree plays a part in it, whether you're just an individual voting or a person building a road or a person teaching at a school or you serve in office. It's not all just Washington, Lincoln, and whoever. Having said that, the years we're talking about and what we're talking about here is about foreign policy. And while a president has certain constraints in domestic policy and what goes on within the United States, because the Constitution says that the president is commander-in-chief, the president has more power in foreign policy. And so, as we're talking about the changing role of America in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, we're talking about the choices of just a handful of people. So we start with William McKinley, who became president in 1897 after a landslide victory. He was the Republican nominee, defeated the Democratic nominee, William Jennings Bryan. You don't need to know that. And I don't know that McKinley thought of himself as an imperialist, as a person trying to found an American empire, but he kind of did. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain because of, there aren't very many good reasons, honestly. The USS Maine, an American ship, exploded and sank in the harbor in Havana, Cuba, and Spain was blamed for this. Spain didn't do it. It was probably an accident, but it caused the United States to go to war with Spain, which at that time owned Cuba and was trying to put down a rebellion there. And so the United States sent its forces to Cuba and fought a naval war against Spain in the Pacific, and it was over very quickly because Spain was a very declining power and America was an emerging, growing power. Now, it's also important to understand that this was new. The idea of America as a world power was brand new. When the country was founded, when it became independent, it was a small, kind of poor, militarily weak country on the eastern seaboard, and that's about it. But over that 100 years, between 1800 and 1900, the country grew, right? It grew during the Louisiana Purchase, doubled the size of the country. After the Mexican-American War, and the annexation of Texas, there was more territory. By the end of the Civil War, for instance, there were about 900,000 Union troops in uniform. That's powerful. And the Union Navy was growing as well. So even though there was a little bit of European snobbery towards the United States, those nations quietly recognized that America was becoming powerful, especially economically, which can fund everything else. So when the United States fought that war, very quick war against Spain in Cuba and in the Pacific, it was kind of announcing its presence on the world stage. Like, we're going to run this kind of stuff now. Now, this wasn't new. The Monroe Doctrine, which was 1823, 24, somewhere in there. You don't need to know the date exactly. The United States said, hey, look, Europe, you need to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. We'll run those things. And that's a nice thing to say in 1823, but couldn't back it up then. The British foreign minister referred to the United States as a little dog with a big bark. at the time. But once you get to 1900, the little dog's not so little anymore. So now you have to decide what to do with that power. After McKinley left office, and he left office because he was shot and killed, wasn't a peaceful thing, Theodore Roosevelt became president. And if you ever wanted to accelerate America as a growing power, that's how you do it. You make Theodore Roosevelt president. It's like pouring gas on a fire. He was the youngest president in American history. He was 42, which I know sounds ancient to you, but in terms of presidents, that's half of what the current president is. It's half of the age of the last president. Very young, very energetic, had fought in that war, was a war hero from the war against Spain. And he changed what the presidency was. He made it a much more active thing. The condition we have today, where we look to a president, whoever it is, and expect that person to solve our problems, get prices down, or fix this or fix that, that might be realistic, it might not be realistic, but where it came from is Theodore Roosevelt. Until that point, the presidency was not as vigorous. Only Jackson and Lincoln before him had really, exercised the full potential powers of the office. And Lincoln, of course, did that during a civil war. It was an emergency. Roosevelt looked at it differently. He thought of himself as the steward of the people, that it was his job to solve problems. And so there was any number of, I could do a whole course, honestly, on Theodore Roosevelt, forget a lecture. But the way he applied that idea to foreign policy was to get things done. He intervened in Panama when the nation of Panama wanted to declare its independence from Colombia. He didn't exactly fight, but he put American warships nearby to kind of quietly intervene. And as a result, Panama became independent and signed a deal with the United States. And that's how we have the Panama Canal, which is a very important economic way of getting stuff through that canal instead of going all the way around the world or all the way down past the southern tip of America and out to the Pacific. It's a huge economic lifeline. And it's essentially the creation of Theodore Roosevelt. I talk a little bit about Taft and dollar diplomacy in the written lecture, so I think we're good there. But Woodrow Wilson comes into office in 1913, and he doesn't really want to be a foreign policy president. This happens sometimes. You get elected to be a domestic president. George W. Bush didn't plan on being a wartime president, but then 9/11 happened. Same kind of thing with Wilson. He comes in 1913. He's got domestic agenda. He wants to reform the banking system, create the Federal Reserve, do all these things, and he does. But then a year later, World War I begins in Europe. And it's, as you will read about in the written lecture, it's widespread destruction and devastation, and millions of people are killed. It is the first big war after industrialization. So you're not firing an old musket at somebody anymore. You're firing, machine guns. And you have primitive planes, and you have primitive tanks, and you have poison gas. This is not like a gentleman riding around on horseback kind of war anymore. This is basically hell on earth. And the American people did not want to get into it, and neither did President Wilson. And so he spent 4 years trying to keep the United States out, and got reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But then in 1917, Germany, which was one of the two sides of these powers that were fighting in the war, got very desperate. I'm going to talk more about the war, hopefully, in more detail in a future module if time allows. But for the purposes of the America as a growing power thing, it became very difficult to stay out of the war because Germany started sinking any ship it saw on the high seas, including American ships. It was called unrestricted submarine warfare. They were using their U-boats, their submarines, to sink enemy ships, and that was fine. But then they started sinking all the ships, and that was not fine. And so there was this dramatic moment where this president, a well-meaning person, not perfect by any means, but a well-meaning person who had tried for years to use diplomacy and economic pressure and whatever he could do to keep America out of the war, now concludes that he has no choice but to take America to war. And so he arranges to be invited to speak to Congress. And on an evening, a dark, sounds like a story, but it's true, like a dark, rainy evening, he climbs into his limousine in the White House and is driven down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. And in front of, there's the module, by the way, the module picture, the little picture for each module, that's a depiction of Wilson talking to Congress on this day. The House and the Senate are assembled. He's announced. He comes in to applause. He stands at the rostrum, and he gives a speech in which he asks Congress to declare war on Germany. And there's no recording of this, but there are credible historians and newspaper articles from the time that say at the moment that he asked Congress to declare war, there was a huge bolt of lightning and a thunderclap in the sky to sort of, unintentionally provide extra drama. And so the United States entered the war, unprepared to do so. Small army, not much of a navy, not really ready, but a gigantic economic power, right? And people joined. And so we started sending ships over there, and these big, like cruise line type ships, and pretty soon they're unloading 10,000 men per day. And so there's 1 million Americans over there fighting. And it was decisive, even though they weren't honestly the best troops because of the relative lack of amount of training. They were very well prepared, and there just was a lot of them. If two people are fighting in a parking lot, this is a terrible example, but I'll do it. If there's two people fighting in a parking lot and it's a draw, and these are two experienced fighters, and they fight for an hour and nobody wins, but then just some random guys who aren't experienced fighters, like, 3 or 4 extra dudes come in on one side, you don't have to be the best fighter. You're fresh, right? That's what happened here. As strong as the Germans were on the Western Front, they broke because they had 4 years of fighting, and now you've got a brand new enemy. And it was decisive. And so the United States and its allies won the war. But the problem is, and I'm going to wrap up here, time-wise, now you're really a world power. Now people are expecting you to lead. Now people are going to be like, are you going to step in whenever there's a problem? And that's going to lead to what's called isolationism, which is, hey, we did this once. We don't want to come back. That's a subject for another day. Okay, write this up, use your own words, answer the questions, and we'll go from there.